Hello everyone and welcome to our webinar, Choosing Books for the Year 2 Classroom. I'm Nikki Gamble, Director at Just Imagine, and Just Imagine has a portfolio of resources for schools including Take One Book and our award-winning Reading Gladiators book club, which I'm thrilled to be able to say that we're making free to schools next year. So from next academic year, Reading Gladiators is going to be completely free to all schools. So if you would like to know more about those projects, then please do get in touch with us at assistant@justimagine.co.uk. Well, books and reading have been a personal passion of mine for as long as I can remember. I was lucky enough to have parents who ignited that early interest. And I've enjoyed sharing that passion through the books that I've written, which are Exploring Children's Literature, which is now in its 4th edition. Very grateful to anybody who's bought that. And also co-author of Guiding Readers with David Reedy, Wayne Tennant and Angela Hobsbawm. Today, my very special guest is Kiran Satti. And Kiran, I know, is another tireless advocate for children's books and reading. She's a primary teacher and very involved in the women's ed movement. Now, when I first met Kiran at a hotel in Birmingham, I knew I'd found a kindred spirit. Her enthusiasm bubbled over and we chatted non-stop all evening. But of course, I've invited her today in her capacity as teacher and reading leader. So I'd like to start by asking Kiran to tell you a little bit about herself and what her current role involves. Hi, Kiran.
Hi, Nikki. Thank you so much for asking me to join you on this. So I'm currently a Year 2 teacher and Key Stage 1 phase lead. I've been doing that for the past 3-4 years now. Reading lead at this school, but I was previously English lead as well. So I've taken a lot of what I've done as English lead at the first school in this trust and brought it to this school, probably in a little more depth now without having the writing element. I'm primary trust literacy leader as well, so I help schools across the trust as well, focusing more on reading than anything because that's our big drive, and it's part of our mission statement. It's one of the first things that we talk about when we're introducing people to the trust or the schools, that reading is a foundation for all of us, and it's very consistent in how we approach that message that we're all passionate advocates for reading, because without that, the grounding isn't ready for children to learn. Year 2 teacher, but I've taught across all key stages, not because it is where I am now, but I do love Year 2, just because you see that journey, you see it from phonics to them reading, actually reading, and having those good discussions as well. I can actually say Tiny Owl Publishers have, my children had read one of their new books, Human Town, and they'd reviewed it with their little bits. So I shared that with the author and Tiny Owl, and they've just published that on Twitter today. So I can't wait to tell the children tomorrow that you were real life reviewers as well. So they're very insightful at that age. I think they are at any age, but I think there's an innocence to their insightfulness as well, which is it's pure when they look at a book and you discuss it with them. So I don't know if that's
really interesting, and everybody can tell that what I said about you is completely true, that your enthusiasm is like a volcano and it just bubbles up and it infects us all in the most positive way. And I'm having a look really now at the environment you're in. This looks like a brand new library. Have you been involved in this?
Yes, so definitely teamwork. So this room was it was just a bit of a nothing room, and it was calling out to be a library. So during the second pandemic, when I moved to this school, it was the project that we would do. So very, very grateful. We invested a lot of money in books, the dream, like books, all of the books that you could ever wish for, and we keep investing. So every few months I will keep investing in this library, because it's important too. The children use it all the time. It looks very tidy because it's respected. So we have children that will come in at break times just to make sure the library is tidy for the next group of children to be using it. But the way that we have sort of organised it is that we have our class text, we have our E3L. So E3L is our themes that we're doing across school, across the trust, and then it's sort of like a reference library towards the back, very diverse in the books that we have. So when we talk about inclusivity, which we know we're going to talk about, we have books about different races, different cultures, but we've also got books that have got Braille in them. So we don't have any blind children in school. However, it's important for children to understand the lived experience of a child who can't see, just so we're building empathy and things like that as well. We have our Rocket Phonics, so we have our phonics books as well, so banded books. However, we balance that out with real engaging text as well, which would link to the child's phonic phase as well. So if they feel that they wanted to read a real, like Rocket Phonics is good, they are real stories, but if they wanted to read Shark in the Park because they're at that phase, they can see that the sound is there. There's that element as well. Yeah, but it's very much a labour of love, and you can see there's trees, and on that wall there's butterflies, so it's very much my design. But very much teamwork. I couldn't have done it without the team around me. So from moving furniture out, moving the books out, to building the furniture, bringing it in, polishing the floors, painting the walls, organising the books, cataloguing them. It's been a labour of love, and I think the children, this is what's ignited the love of reading, I think, more so than anything in the school, because this room, it elevated the status of reading straight away when it was done. And the fact that we've invested so much in it is telling the children, yes, we want you to read, you deserve to be reading all these books. I mean, some of the shelves look like Waterstone shelves, it's just, it's a lovely environment for them, and it's diverse.
Thank you so much. I'm sure we'll come back to some of that as we move forward in our discussion. And you're going to be helping me to outline some of the principles that we bear in mind when we select books for year 2. The books that I'm talking about, or that we are talking about in this webinar, are books that we might describe as books that would encourage reading for pleasure. We're not really talking about books necessarily that we would use for teaching, but we might well be reading them aloud, sharing them, talking about them, sending them home for children to read or to talk about with parents. So that's the kind of collections that we're looking at today. And before we start, I want to just talk a little bit about what we know about readers in this stage between the ages of around 6 and 7. So we're going to start first of all about taking flight. There you are. There's a lovely little bird. You'll like that, won't you, Kiran?
Yeah, very cute. Yeah.
So I want to start by giving a brief overview. And from various studies, including perception surveys and those that we carry out at Just Imagine periodically as well, we know that popular choices of books include things about the natural world, especially animals, and it seems that you can never have enough animals, adventure and humour, almost more specifically, books that make you laugh, because humour doesn't always make you laugh, but that's a long story. Those tend to be hugely popular as well. When you actually ask children at this age to describe what reading is, they will often describe it as a physical act rather than something that you do in your head. So they talk about something that you do with your eyes. They may, probably not in Kiran's school, but many children will think that reading and decoding are synonymous. This depends obviously on their experience with books, both at home and at school. And it's not uncommon for children to become preoccupied with the idea that getting better at reading means reading longer books with fewer pictures and harder words. And they can have those perceptions regardless of what we do as teachers, interestingly enough. So self-motivation and aspiration are not negative unless they become self-defeating and lead to loss of confidence. It is vital that children have opportunities to read, to share, and to talk about books that have interesting ideas and thrilling stories. And simply written books, indeed wordless books, may well provoke deeper thought than densely written text peppered with polysyllabic words. While there will be individual differences, most children in year 2 are understand, of course, that written language conveys meaning. And many of the points raised in the webinar about choosing books for year 1 remain important for children in year 2. We provide books that make connections with other books and with personal experience. We provide books that have a wide range of narrative style and tone that encourage flexible reading. And it remains important that we do not too readily leave pictures behind. Picture books in particular offer themselves up to be read in multiple ways, often showing rather than telling, in the complex ways in which pictures and words work together, or in the gaps that are implied by the dramatic turn of a page. Additionally, we might be broadening children's experience of visual language, offering a range of illustrative and design styles. I think sometimes we have to be aware that our own preferences might limit what we make available to children. Saying they wouldn't like it or understand it, when perhaps we really mean I don't like it or understand it. Of course, it's important to provide lots of traditional stories, including myths and fables, but with increasingly playful interpretations too. Through interactions with these stories, children see that they are not fixed, but can be remade, and that they're open to interpretation. Poetry collections are vitally important, like nuggets of gold wrapped in small packages covering a wide range of emotions. It's also worth noting that while pictures must continue to be valued for their own sake, not as secondary to text, there is also something magical that children will begin to experience, and that is that you can create your own imaginary worlds simply through words alone. So with all of this in mind, we're going to consider what kinds of books are especially good for readers in year 2. But as always, I would start with children's interests and their reading interests. So I'm going to ask Kiran what her children are enjoying reading at the moment.
It's such a big question. I think I definitely have a community of readers in the classroom, in the sense that they like to read lots of different things. So one thing that I do quite regularly in the classroom is book blankets, because one thing that I've noticed is, and I don't know if it's something in a few schools that I have noticed, so book blankets was something that I wanted to bring in quite regularly, so that I was widening their repertoire for reading, because with that, it widened their language, it would widen their understanding. And I think any child who has ever been taught by me knows kindness and empathy are very, very important. So it was interesting what you were saying about the certain teacher choices that you'd put, but I think certain things, certain stories I would always put out. So the old man would be one that I would always put out, or Bigu is something I would always put out, just because I'd want the children eventually to get round to those sort of stories to understand each other a bit more as well, and therefore they'll listen to each other a bit more when they're talking about their own books. So there's always a reason. But at the moment they are loving picture books, so it is picture books really. My children that are a little more confident will choose to read sort of like the meatier text, I suppose we have. So the one that we have, so Rabbit and Bear, a lot of them love reading that together as a group. And they like they like the fact that, you know, some animals are eating poo and how it's funny, and it's that humour, like anything to do with farts or poo they love. But I think it's a community more than the books in this sense, they like to share what they're reading. So at one point I could have a few of them, they've read a few, and when I say reading, it's just a few pages of a few books, and that's absolutely fine, but there is that conversation with it as well. And so when they see someone else reading a book that they may have spoken about the other day, they'll then go over and speak to those children about that book. And I think that's where the links and ideas of themes and motives and imagery comes through. And the language is a lot richer when you're talking for writing. So when we're thinking about stories, and we've got a bank of shared experiences there. So book blankets, I think, have opened up their repertoire. They love mixed. I mean, there's some books that they just absolutely can't get enough of, like Mixed. Right, like we read it again today, and it's So we'll look at intonation and we'll look at different ways of reading it. We'll the blues today because we were too cool to read it with expression, so we were just reading it blasé. But they just love picture books at the moment, and slowly some of the children are getting into the more meatier chapter books. But they like perusing, they like exploring, they like talking about books. Non-fiction has been a big thing that I think our relationship with Chris Lloyd definitely has helped that. So one of the exciting things that I've done this academic year is bring Chris Lloyd into schools, where we've really ignited that love of non-fiction, in the sense that it's the real world. And what you were saying about children loving nature and animals, they love these big books because they're diving into the real world of nature and animals in a way that's it's enabling them to explore, but in a very it's not intimidating. The non-fiction books aren't intimidating to them because they're so visual that they literally want to dive into the book. So non-fiction has been something that they're really enjoying. So the dinosaur books that we have, like the big books, the timeline books that we have as well, they're really enjoying. And again, it's the discussion. I love it when I know that the children are talking, because that's telling me they are enjoying what they're reading and they're getting something from it. So yeah, they're just, I could go on and on, to be honest, but they love just reading books.
I'm just going to stop you for a moment. I think most people who are watching this probably know what a book blanket is. Mm-hmm. But it's possible there are some that are saying, book blanket, what is that? So perhaps in just a sentence, if you could tell people what a book blanket is.
It's literally blanketing the carpet, your tables, with books, and that's it. And they choose which book they want to read, want to look at, maybe pick up, put down. There are no rules with a book blanket. It's very much take a little piece of it, bring it back when you're ready to, bring it to another child who's got another book. It's a very open-ended reading experience, I suppose. And we've linked it in with cozy reading. So again, reading for pleasure. It's just reading. I mean, they all they don't have a choice, I suppose. It's almost like you have to love reading, in the sense that it's going to open your world. But it's the conversation, having that conversation around the books. That's what's giving the children ownership. And it's also inclusive in the sense that there are different levels of reading ability in the class, but everyone is involved, everyone feels included. So they're all picture books, but every child I know will be able to look at that picture book or get something from that picture book. Every child will get something from a chapter book as well, because we're a community of readers. So if they want some of the children to just help them read it, or listen to another child read it to them, it's like you're wrapping your classroom with a blanket of books, is the best way I can describe it. And the children are choosing which thread they want to sort of pull out a bit and read a bit more of.
Brilliant. So let's move on and have a look at some of the book choices. So first of all, I was going to say, let's have fun. So one of the things that I've become increasingly aware of and mentioned in the Year 1 webinar is that so many books have very explicit messages in them, and that there are increasingly less books that are being published that are just for the sheer delight and the fun of the story, or just to have a laugh. Now, I'm not dismissing books that have important messages. You've talked about some yourself, Kiran, but it's important that we also don't convey that a book always has to have an agenda. Some of the great classics of children's books, Where the Wild Things Are, Julia Donaldson's The Gruffalo, books that we know that children love and return to, don't have very heavy moral messages. In fact, they probably don't have any moral message in them at all. So I wanted to start really just by thinking about having fun, and the sheer delight of reading, because it is about winning hearts and minds. They have to know that something is going to be in it for them. And you've expressed very eloquently, actually, how children have to make that meaning for themselves. So here are some of the books that I currently love, that are just about having a just a tremendous fun and good time with reading. So in the Year 1 webinar, if anybody has watched that, I had another book in the series, the Bunnies series, called Bunnies on a Bus. So Bunnies in the Boat is the recently published sequel to that. And these bunnies are still causing mayhem, not with any ill intent, but just because they have a tremendous joie de vivre. Unfortunately, they do have a habit of creating chaos in their wake, as we'll see when we have a look at one of the internal spreads. A Bear's Guide to Beekeeping I love, because again, this is really interesting at Year 2, you know, the introduction of other kinds of text within a text. This one has got, you know, your traditional manual or how-to guide, but has been produced in a really fun way, because Bear obviously wants to keep bees for his own purposes. Do you know any of these on here, Kiran?
The bear looks familiar. It reminds me of the Case of the Missing Cake, the alphabet book, but it's not an alphabet book. We absolutely adore that one, and it is just sheer fun and joy, that book. And we love the piggy and elephant ones as well. We are in a I think you're completely right in that sense, that you need to capture the children's heart, and they need to have that experience of just literally falling in love with a story, falling in love with a character, and it's just the joy of it. So I totally I want to. Robo Baby is the one that I keep looking at and I haven't got yet. So that's the one that I've spotted that I really want to. I want to get that one.
Let me show you some internal spreads, and we can perhaps say a little bit about each of these stories as we go through. Sean Taylor, again, I had one of his books in the Choosing Books for Year 1 webinar, but this one is all about a cool pair of sunglasses. And the characters in this story, I think you'll love it if you like Piggy and Elephant, because the characters in this story think that once they put on their cool pair of sunglasses, they're going to be really cool, but things always go wrong. So there are all these mishaps. And I think this is a great book for acting out loud. I love performance and text and really going to town when reading the books. I'd have the dark pair of sunglasses with me. I'd be getting children in the class to wear the different pair of sunglasses and really acting those characters out, because I know they'd love it. Can you see your children enjoying this one?
Oh, goodness, yeah. Some of them have brought their shades in. I could literally just imagine some of them now. Yeah, definitely. Get it under the visualizer, yeah.
I'm going to send you a copy, only on condition that you let me know how it goes with the sunglasses.
Absolutely, of course. As long as the sun's still out, yeah, absolutely, yeah. I'll have to just get them some.
This is the internal spread from Robo Baby. So how do robots have babies? Well, it doesn't go into the mechanics of that, excuse the pun, but they send away for them, and then they get them in a kind of IKEA kit that they have to build. And the trouble is that parents in this story, they just don't follow the instructions. And you can see that there's a little robot here, and the little robot, I've forgotten the name of the little robot. It's some mechanical part like fulcrum, or anyway, I can't recall exactly. But the little robot keeps pointing them to the instructions, and they get all the other robots along. And of course, in the end, the little robot is proved to be right. You're seeing a very final spread here where the baby has been made. Can you guess what the little robot's pointing to? Don't worry if you can't.
Look, what's he pointing to?
It's another box, because actually they were twins. So they're going to have to do it all over again. Anyway, that's David Wiesner, who of course is well known for Flotsam Tuesday, etc. But I think this is a really good one for younger children. Okay, I just had to show you a spread from Bunnies in a Boat. This one's quite a way on in the story, just so that you can see the sorts of mayhem that they are causing. I love the fact that they're kind of speeding through the spaghetti restaurant. It's called Marinara Seafood, because you wouldn't feed seafood to a lobster, would you? That would be really good thing to do. But it's kind of zooming over the heads of these bears, and they're totally unaware of what's happening.
Oh, they
And
love it.
do you love it?
Yeah.
And the great thing with this story is that you can read it and you can reread it, and there are going to be subplots that you can look at and characters that you can follow, different characters that you can follow. This will be a great one for your book blanket, actually. Really see groups of children getting together, talking about that.
Yeah.
Those one. I love that, you know, this idea that children need lots of different narrative styles, that this develops flexible readers who can cope with new forms of literacy as they emerge. I love the fact that we have the commentary here from the little blue bird, who's sort of the conscience of the bear, if you like, and always telling him what he's not doing right. So I love that dialogue that's going on. There you are. All the bees have a name that begins with B, by the way. Of course they do. They're bees.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so, I mean, that's just a few, isn't it? And there are lots. And I'm sure you've got lots in your library and in your classroom as well. My next category was about playing with well-known stories. So, again, in the Year 1 webinar, we talk about making sure children have access to traditional stories, fairy tales from all over the world, but we use the or read and share straight versions first of all, so that when you have more jokey versions, particularly those that are more knowing, that actually they understand the joke. It's not that you can't read them younger, but they just won't get the full flavour of it unless they have that background. So I think by the time children are coming into Year 2, providing all of that groundwork has been done, then we can start having real fun with some of these well-known stories. Would you recognise that from your experience?
Absolutely, and I think it's you'd want them to get into the habit of being able to retell those traditional stories as well, so they understand what a story are, they understand how to bring in new characters, and it's the easiest way to teach cohesive devices as well. So I think getting them so grounding them in sort of good story structures, the best way to do it is fairy tales. And like you say, so when we bring in Anthony Brown in Year 2 and we look at the tunnel, straight away they will see the links to Red Riding Hood, but then they will see the links to Hansel and Gretel maybe as well. So then we'll look at Anthony Brown's Hansel Gretel, and then he's got a lot of woodlands in his stories anyway. So then there's lots of intertextual links that they're making, but then I love bringing in things like Little Red as well. So if they know the story of Little Red Riding Hood, I have to read Little Red to them, and every child I've ever read that book to, especially in Year 2, they have loved it. It's very dark humour, I know, but they loved it. And then you can bring in sort of like the reworked version of Hansel and Gretel, the reworked version of Rapunzel, and they have that understanding of the story structure. And like you say, it's fun then to play around with it, and not just when we're thinking about the funny stories, but when we're looking at different versions of Cinderella. So when we look at fairy tales, we make sure that we do have a representation of what Cinderella might look like in different cultures and the different sorts of names that she might have had. So the Egyptian Cinderella, Cinderella of the Nile, and then, Beauty and the Beast, Reading Beauty. So it's, once you've got that sort of canon, because it is a canon in itself, it's then you can then play with it in lots of different ways. But having that good grounding of that understanding of a story structure is so important. And it's the rhyme elements as well. So all of that literacy, early language development as well, the repeating phrases, the rule of 3 with 3 little pigs, things like that, it all comes through. And then that's where you'll get readers who turn into writers, because they'll want to start writing stories like that for themselves. So definitely agree with what you say.
I just mentioned a couple of Little Red Riding Hoods for you. I take it it's the Beth and Wolven Little Red that you're talking about, because there are a couple of books that have the same title, but I'm guessing it's that one. So I know you'll know the Alex T. Smith book. It's Little Red and the Hungry Lion, I think.
Yes,
And you may not be so familiar with Jerry Pinkney, who's an American author illustrator, and thanks to Alistair Daniel, that's now a staple in my Red Riding Hood collection, because it is a straight telling of Red Riding Hood, but with an African American child as Red Riding Hood. So I recommend that one to everybody. Let's have a quick look at some of the interiors from these. Do you know this? I am not a prince. I mean, imagine if you were a frog and you were in fairy tale land and you didn't want to be a prince. Well, that's what happens to our frog in this story. And he's kind of banished from the kingdom. And it is obviously a story about being comfortable in your own skin. The great thing about fairy tales and fables is that the message can be read in so many different ways. So there will be people who can appreciate the sort of LGBTQ aspect to this story, but it's about anybody being comfortable in their own skin. And as I say, fairy tales are so good at not being so didactic, but allowing us to interpret them in ways that are meaningful to us. So I've got a feeling you might like that. Sorry?
Can I just add to that? Because I think that's a really interesting point, that because I've been doing research into sort of that understanding of fairy tales in different contexts and different times as well. And this theory about neuroplasticity came to me, where a child's brain is moldable, so it's like plastic and you can mold it. And when we think like what you've just said about LGBTQ, fairy tales have been considered as quite gendered. So a princess is very girly, a princess is very like it's very passive or whatever it is. But I think that's what's amazing about fairy tales, that within a new, so it could be the same fairy tale, but because times have changed, cultures, understanding of gender and biological, what sex is compared to gender, so one's biological, one's constructed by culture, it is that having those interpretations of these fairy tales is more powerful now, I suppose. And then having even like reworked versions of them, it's going to ground these children when they grow up to see the world as a spectrum, not just as this and that. It's very much a spectrum, and it should be open to interpretation.
And very often it's the tales that we've chosen, particularly in the Victorian period, to tell and retell to children. And actually there's some really interesting stories if you go back further in time, and also explore stories from different cultures, as I know you have talked about as well. If you like Elephant and Piggy, you're going to love Little Chick. So, you know, again, I love this kind of direct, it's a little bit like Don't Let the Pigeon Drive the Bus, you know, this direct talk to the audience, breaking the fourth wall there. So you'll love that. Lucy Rowlands, there are no big bad wolves in this story. Just really delightful. So we're championing traditional stories, and there are many retellings and versions here. Earlier I talked about visual language and perhaps being, you know, a little more adventurous and risk-taking with some of the imagery that we explore with children. And my next section is really about a broad range of visual style, because I know you know, Kiran, that illustration has its own language too. So let's have a look at some of these. Anything that you recognise there? I think you know Milo, because I'm sure I've heard you talk about Milo.
Yeah, it's. I think when I first read that, it took me by surprise actually, because I wasn't expecting the way that the story was, because I didn't read anything about it beforehand. And yeah, I was tentative as to how I would share it with the children. But again, I think that's the point that I was making about they're insightful, and it's pure what they see is what they tell you. And some of them were a little bit, oh, okay. And so we read it a few more times, and that's when you can sort of look back at Milo's journey and sort of see what he was seeing, and then we were then reinterpreting his journey. But that one, I think that, I mean, the others look beautiful. Anthony and the Gargoyle, again, it's, you know, when you want to just spend the whole day or maybe week with the children reading all these books. But Milo was definitely one that it was like I can't explain it, to be honest. It was a very feeling, not a heavy one. It was a very, oh, that's unexpected. Let's have a look at it again. But a few books recently, because there were, you get to know your children as well, and you get to know the phase a lot better, so you can bring these stories to them a bit more. But that one definitely is.
Can I just stop you again, Kiran?
Yeah.
Because I'm aware that there might be some people listening who don't know the book. I wonder if you could just summarise again, just a sentence or a couple of sentences, so that they know.
With that, I don't want to give it away, but then do I give it away? So Milo's on.
You just tell us the beginning and.
So he's on. So he's with his sister on the train, and they're going to see their parent, who is away. But he's drawing. It reminded me a lot of Stop the Clock, actually, but in reverse, because he was drawing and he was taking it all in, whereas he needed to stop the clock with the other story. And he's observing people, and it's his perception of those people. So a little boy is on there on the train in a suit, and he has a certain perception of this little boy. And that was the thing that struck us when we were looking back at it. There were dancers that were coming on the train, and people's perceptions of them, and how he would interpret people's perceptions of these dancers, or how they might be viewed in society. And that's what it was. And I think it's very loaded in a lot of ways, because it's telling us how Milo might perceive himself, or how he fears other people might perceive him, or how he is perceived because of where his parent is. And then when we get to the end of the story, some of the things that he's perceived to begin with, he changes his mind, because the little boy in the suit is the thing that really, it struck a chord with us, actually, because it's about not judging anyone by their cover, and we can all end up in the same situation. And it builds on that point of everyone's fighting their own battles as well, that you shouldn't judge. It's, you meet someone where they are, and you take that person for who they are at that time, rather than having any preconceived ideas of where they might be going, where they've come from. It's a very deep book. I think that's why it was, when we'd read it, there was just a lot to think about, really. And then when you go back through it, you can unpack a lot of it.
I think a lot of these books, with the webinar's called Choosing Books for Year 2, but of course it's a false line to draw to say that you couldn't go on enjoying and exploring that book all the way through the primary years. And there's something for all of us, even adults, in these books. But what's really interesting to me is that through, an adult sharing and talking about the books, this is what really helps children to come to some of the deeper understandings that are, held within it. So should we have a look at some of the internal spreads for these? So this one is windows. Just love the nighttime feel of this, and the idea of looking through. Again, it's about our perception of what others are doing. The stories that are going on behind windows. Lovely book. The Fan Brothers, we've got the Fan Brothers in a number of our collections. This one is in year 2. This one was published in the UK earlier this year. And again, I love what children have made of this story. A marble, well, we know it's a marble, falls from the sky, and all of the garden creatures think it's something really magical. Of course, the child's been playing in the garden and has dropped a marble, but to them it's something magical that's come from the sky. And what happens is that one of the creatures in the garden takes ownership of this and starts to make a profit out of it. It's actually an early lesson in capitalism and socialism, really. But of course, you don't necessarily have to express it in those terms. And like the stories that we talked about earlier, they can be interpreted in many different ways. It's monochromatic, except for this brilliant colour of the cod's eye marble, or the fish eye marble that we've got there. The Comet, I think this is one that you know, isn't it,
Love
Kiran?
this one. Absolutely adore this one. I haven't read it to the class as a whole. Been reading it to groups of children at a time, because I really want them to take it in. There's certain children that I know will get something different from it, whereas other children they'll just love the book. So I've been really careful with how I've shared this one because it's I think this is a very special one. Very special.
So briefly, I will just say it is about a little girl who we think lives alone with her father. We're not sure what's happened to the female in the family. She is kind of there at the beginning of the story, but the turning point is where the girl and her father move house from their wonderful sort of countryside home where the little girl feels very much in touch with her environment, into the city. And it's how she comes to see some of the magic in that and to build her home with her father and a comet, which has occurred both in the first home in the countryside and a comet that she sees in the city, which you can see there going to crash to earth and forming this wonderful tree that she goes off to explore. It is a very moving book and beautifully executed by Joe Todd Stanton. This is Anthony and the Gargoyle that you mentioned briefly. I will just say it's a wordless book. There is a podcast that you might want to listen to that I made with both the author and the illustrator. And any of our podcasts you can find by searching for In the Reading Corner. It's on Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, etc. Beatrice Alamagna, or I should say, well, I say Beatrice Alamagna, but she's Italian, so obviously that isn't the correct pronunciation of her first name. And, her style is very painterly and not necessarily one that children might reach for, first of all, but by having those books in the classroom, we are broadening their visual taste and visual language. It's a brilliant story about how parents who don't really provide for their child's birthday party but get somebody else in to organise it actually get more than they bargain for when all the animals come to play. So it's a bit anarchic. I love an anarchic story. And then from anarchy to total calm, with this one, which is the depth of the lake, the height of the sky and the depth of the lake. This is a Korean book, another wordless story. And it starts with this young boy and his family who live in a city. And you can see that they're packing, ready to go somewhere. In fact, they're going to the grandparents who live in the country. But you get lots of clues about this boy from the environment of his bedroom. You get the sense that he loves nature, that he wants to explore the world. They go on this long car journey, and then there are these very quiet and reflective pictures. So the complete opposite to the book that I've just shown you. And again, just lovely to see, both to talk to children, but also to allow moments of quiet, I think, for looking. And just out this month, Flooded. Again, very different visual style. This is in a world where a flood is coming. But again, it's fable. It's not talking about climate change explicitly, though undoubtedly some people will read that into the story. And the animals don't seem to care because, they like splashing in water and it gives them a chance to wear their wellies. But there's the tiniest of creatures who keeps trying to get them to notice. Excuse me, you could think Greta Thunberg and big, powerful political leaders, but you don't have to think about it in that way. That's because we bring that to the story. The floods rise, the flood waters rise, and eventually all of the animals are underwater, and it's only when it affects them that they want to take action. So and then they pull the plug out. You can see some of these animals with glass bowls on their head. They've had to walk around that to stop themselves from drowning, and they pull the plug at the end of the story.
Wow.
Ooh. Okay, so just a few more sections to go. Rhyme, rhythm, and poetry. So we've talked in previous webinars about the importance of rhyming text, and Kiran's also mentioned them already a little earlier. Of course, we still want to keep those rhyming stories going. Peter Bentley being fantastic at this, and the Royal Leapfrog also fits one of our earlier categories where we were talking about remaking fairy tales. In this case, it's a Hans Christian Andersen story, one that you might not be familiar with, but it's called The Leapfrog. And then wonderful poetic non-fiction like Dom Conlan's Blow, Wind, Blow, but also the importance of having poetry collections in the classroom. I described them earlier as tiny little golden nuggets in which you can wrap up all kinds of emotions. And you can change the mood in a classroom by reading a poem instantly, a funny poem, a sad poem, a happy poem. And also they don't outface children who are just getting, to grips with word reading. So I think that poetry for me, it would be one of the first things that I would do if I had a year 2 classroom, would be to go and check what kinds of poetry and rhyming stories that were available.
We have rhymes across the curriculum, so it was one thing that we were very conscious of. It. We didn't have enough poetry in our curriculum to begin with. So one of the things in year 2 we do is we do learn poetry off by heart as well. So the book collection off by heart is absolutely wonderful. And I've started using it as part of my transition. So when I want children to start packing away, we'll use some of the poems as our transition. So come said the wind to the leaves one day, and then by the time they're finished reciting it, we've tidied and we're ready for the next step or the next part of the day. So I think but again, it's building communities as well. I think poetry is a great way of building a community of readers because it is inclusive again, and it's a lovely way when building in fluency development, so reading in phrasal unit. Everybody can do that, and then you can play with intonation, you can play with emphasising the rhymes a bit more. So I think we were very conscious that we needed to have more poetry in to enable to embellish their reading lives, I suppose, more than anything. That they're nuggets of gold, like you say.
So interesting to hear what you're doing there. So let's just have a quick look at some of these poetry collections. Again, you can't confine a poetry collection really to a year group. I'm looking at bursts of colour, and while I would certainly be reading some of those poems with year 2, equally some of them are going to be very meaningful to readers in year 6. So just because it's here in this webinar doesn't mean that we're seeing it as having a restricted age appropriateness. Dom Conlan, this series of 4, or it might be 5 now, poetic non-fiction books. I think both Dom and James Carter are doing great things with poetic non-fiction. And these are so beautifully illustrated as well. This is from Joseph Coelho's latest collection, Poems to Make You Smile. You probably remember Poems Out Loud that was published a couple of years ago. I heard Joe read one of these at the Federation of Children's Book Group conference a couple of months ago, and it instantly transformed the mood in the room. I mean, it was already very positive, but once Joe had read this poem, I think it actually followed a more serious poem, if I recall correctly, that was kind of left us very contemplative. But once Joe had read this poem, your mood was instantly into the smiley, happy place. And I love that about poetry, that it can just lead you somewhere very quickly. So this one is from James Carter's book, Weird, Wonderful, and I'm hopeless at titles. Remind me, Weird, Wonderful, and something else. But again, just a fabulous range of poems in that collection. And then I have put on the screen, this is from Bright Bursts of Colour. And I put this up here deliberately to show that this is really a very serious poem and that there's a lot going on under the surface. The words, it's a case of the words not expressing what's really happening. So a lot of inferencing needs to take place to understand the sort of deeper level of the poem here. But there's nothing wrong with introducing that and, reading that to children, and they'll then encounter it again at a later age, and it will mean something different to them again.
Yeah, absolutely. We've just been reading The Guest House by Rumi, which is a very heavy, deep poem. But like you say, it was Mental Health Awareness Week, obviously, last week, and part of our theme that we're doing at the moment is about mental well-being anyway. And it took some of them a while to understand it, but it is that when they come back to a poem like that, they will hopefully read it a little bit deeper than what they have done already. So even though they're year 2, it didn't stop me from introducing poetry like that to them, because it's about feeling. I mean, all like it's feeling, isn't it, really? That's weaving in those words. So it was, and if anything, it's probably the best way to encourage them to think a bit more about how they're feeling when they're reading poetry or reading anything, really. How does it make you feel?
Yeah, I agree with you entirely. No wonder we talked for so long in Birmingham, because I just agree. I'm just agreeing with you. So I know this is a subject very close to your heart. Are we being inclusive enough? Love the fact that you talked about the Braille books there. And of course, that wonderful book, The Black Book of Colour, which wasn't explicitly made as a book for the visually impaired, but to give a sense of what it's like to be visually impaired. But let's have a look at some of the books here. Any in particular that you would pick out to recommend?
All of them. The One World has definitely captured the children in the sense of, it's almost like the big book, so, and like timelines that we have. So certain part of history, certain point in history, in time, this was happening, but also this was happening. Certain part in the world, where at 1 minute past midnight, but in the different parts of the world, this is what's happening. So one of the children said it makes the world feel smaller but bigger at the same time. And it was that, when you're talking about delight, books give you that sense of delight. It was awe as well. I could see awe in some of them, that they were like, wow, this is a big book of knowledge. The Pride is Blue, I think a lot of people will know that one. And Hey You has been a very interesting one in my classroom, actually, because it has made some children feel a little bit uncomfortable because they couldn't see themselves in the book, which was really interesting. And again, when you think about empathy, and it's putting yourself, you're never going to fully understand everybody else's experiences, but that was really interesting. So some of the children were they didn't know how to take that book. And so that's where the conversation opened up about representation, which is what it's about. And again, it's, I think when they've had, especially with certain books, when they've had that sort of, it is an emotional, not connection, but they've had an emotional response to it, they're going to remember it a lot more as well. And like you say, you want to evoke joy, but sometimes when they have books like this given to them, it evokes something a little bit deeper that hopefully when they're older, they'll exercise it, they'll understand what it might feel when someone isn't represented. It was that Hey You was a very interesting one. And when I've introduced, I find it, is it Sulwe, Sulwe, where it's the two sisters and the one's light-skinned and the protagonist is dark-skinned. Again, a few of the children, and it was that discussion afterwards, but Hey You has been a really interesting one. The Pride is Blue, I think culturally, it's done in a way that, and that one reminded me of the Dearest One as well. Hey You, The Pride is Blue, Dearest One, I could see links between those because it is about who you are as a person and your identity. But Hey You really did, it evoked something a little bit different in some children because they couldn't see themselves in a book, and that was a really interesting conversation to have with them.
I would just say that on lots of lists, I've seen Hey You recommended as a baby's book. And I think it's because a baby is on the front cover. But actually, I think, again, this is one from year 2 upwards, that there's a lot to be gained from, and I haven't put it in earlier collections just because I do think there's more in it.
And the way the artists are, the illustrators are as well in that book, it opens up their world to how different things are seen and different views are presented and represented as well. So it's when I can't remember the other one that we just looked at now. You say that you're awful with titles. It's very artistic, wasn't it? And it's opening that visual literacy to them a bit more as well with that book. So I think it's actually a really sophisticated book.
I agree. I'm just going to show you some internal spreads very quickly. This is from the Queen on our corner. And when we're talking about inclusivity, I really feel that we need to be thinking about those that are disenfranchised through poverty as well. But yet this isn't a gloomy book. You know, that it's done so well by Lucy Christopher and the illustrator here, because it, you know, really makes her the heroine of this story, and others come to see the Queen on the corner as the little girl in this story does. Absolutely love that book. John Agard's Windrush Child, again, not exploiting Windrush because it's his story, and I think that's important too, that we look for books that have that genuine aspect to them. And you know, he wrote this poem a long time ago, and it's just been produced in this illustrated version. You've talked about One World, the little girls from Greenwich going off on their imaginary nighttime flight around the world. I put this in here, Kiran, because there still isn't that much non-fiction that is inclusive, much more so in picture books. We've been doing a project recently in school around science and reading, and with the books that we use, my colleague Jo Castro said, but you know, a lot of the children that we're working with will not recognise themselves in this book, and she suggested, not as an alternative to getting this right at the publishing end, but something that we could do in the meantime, and taking photos of children and adding their faces to the characters in the book, so they start to see themselves in that story, which I think is quite nice.
That's a lovely idea. Yeah, it's a lovely idea.
That's Dapo and all those illustrators in Hey You, and you can see some of that complexity in the illustration that you've been talking about, and of course the proudest blue. So I mean, we've really been talking about promoting empathy as well as inclusivity there, but I just thought, which is why you've got some of the same books on this slide, but really just to emphasize that point, that we are, through books, not only having a good laugh, enjoying our rhymes and our rhythms, but we're promoting values all the time. And these are some wonderful books that do just that. That's Debbie Gliori's A Cat Called Waverley. And then I think, coming towards the end of our presentation, that we read non-fiction for pleasure as well, and we should be reading non-fiction aloud. I'm sure that lots of people in the audience or who are watching this would wholeheartedly agree. Again, Kiran, I'll just ask you, any books on this slide that that you know or would particularly like to recommend?
Anything by Yuval Zommer we have. So the Big Book of Bugs, of everything we have of his. He very kindly had donated some posters to the first school that I worked at the Trust, the Big Book of Blue. So we have all of his collections. One World, What Did the Tree See? That one is such a good one such a good one for many reasons. So you can look at it from a geographical point of view, historical point of view, social point of view, pollution. Like, there's so many ways to look at that one. We've had a really big push on nonfiction. So a lot of we have a collection of Chris Lloyd books as well, because for us, it was really important to make sure that like you say, the children could see themselves being readers of non-fiction as well as fiction, and that they understood, like you've just said, that it's reading for pleasure as well. And the way that those books are produced, I don't know if I can I quickly go and get one to show? Is that be all right?
Yeah, do.
So we have like the dinosaur one. So like
Yes.
And like you just lay that out on the carpet. I'm not doing it justice, really doing it, but it sort of has like the history of the world, of the planet at the top. So that's your timeline, and then what happens, like sort of ground level, sea level, and we have a range of these big poster books as well. So those are dotted around classrooms as well. So it was really important that when we're doing reading for pleasure, that we make sure that we have a range. We have poetry, we have the diversity, we have fiction and non-fiction, because that's how their understanding of the world is going to develop, more so with non-fiction, and they'll get more out of the fiction because of it. So when we've talked about climate change and things like that, having that factual basis of certain things, it's only going to make their reading richer and that experience of understanding richer as well. So yeah, I think non-fiction definitely is something that's really, really important. But I do feel people are picking up on that now a lot more.
And non-fiction that is beyond the curriculum. So
Yes.
I would just invite people to look at their bookshelves and just see,
Yeah.
do I have non-fiction other than supporting my curriculum topics, my foundation subjects? Having said that, this is one that we do use in Take One Book, which is one of our resources for schools. I'm just going to put the link across the bottom in case you wanted to know any more about this, or indeed reading Gladiators. You can find out more about them at justimagine.co.uk. But this is the castle that the king built. It's to the rhyme, this is the house that Jack built. So rhyming story as well, but you learn so much about castles through this wonderful text. I absolutely adore this book by Polly Faber. It's a bit, children love building sites in my experience. And this one is lovely. It's about taking an old building and making it into something new. And the detail in it and the graphic illustration, the wonderful shapes and colour in it are so visually arresting, I think.
Link it to art movements as well, couldn't you? Just thinking, so you've got realism on the one side and then cubism or something, or abstract art on the other side. It's a really interesting one.
There's your tree.
Anything with a tree, yeah.
Yeah. This is from the early part of the book where the tree is still a sapling. Obviously, it becomes a very old oak tree, and there's virtually no greenery around it. It's the last standing tree at the end of this book. This is newly published, or maybe just about to be published, and it's called Slime ? It's Not Mine. It follows a book called Pooh and Wee. I don't generally go for those words, but this is an amazing book because it is all about slime in the natural world. And this lemur, who features in all three of the books, at the beginning of the book, a big glob of slime lands on his head and he goes off to explore who it belongs to. And on the way, learns a lot about how creatures use slime. This is a fish that I think it's called a bubble fish, but anyway, it creates a protective layer of slime around it, which stops predators from eating it. But there are amazing number of ways in which animals use slime, and that's what this book is about. And there you are, Yuval Sommer. This particular book, the Big Book of Belonging, is about how humans are connected to the natural world. I think possibly it's my favourite of them so far, although I'll open another one of his tomorrow and think that's my favourite. So it's very, it is a hard thing to say, but it's just so beautiful. And this idea of connecting humans and the natural world. And then finally, this is, it's a wonderful phrase. I think this is a great one to read aloud to children, and particularly in schools where you might have many children where English is not their first language, idioms can get in the way sometimes. So exploring some of the stories behind them and why we say it's raining cats and dogs, and what might you say in another country where you don't have cats and dogs, what other phrases are there? So a nice one, really, I think, a nice sort of one to share as a teacher with a group or a few children, and to take home and share as well.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, science. We are scientists, we are mathematicians. This one is there are 2 books in the same series, and it's so clearly laid out so that there's a lot of visual things that the children can take from this. They might need some of the text reading. First of all, it is quite text heavy in a lot of ways, and there's a lot of science in there, but it's not beyond them. And I do think it's, let's share it, and then they'll want to go back and look at all those objects. It's the kind of thing that I used to love doing. And then very finally, you talked about chapter fiction, so I'm probably just going to whiz through this, but to say that obviously in year 2, it's that transitional phase, year 2 and year 3, really important for making sure that we've got books in the classroom that are accessible. And I have seen books that are way too hard that children can't read, and they're just not going to be able to read them. When you see lots of collections of Harry Potter in year 2 classrooms, which I have seen, there are other books out there that are going to be much more accessible. So these are some of my favourites, and I'm just going to show you. This is Rabbit and Bear that you mentioned, in these 2-tone colours. This one is from a series in a small square format called Uni Piggle, published by Oxford University Press. It's written and illustrated by Hannah Shaw. I love this series. This is a colour fiction from Little Tiger, and if you don't know that series already, they're little hardback books, really nice to hold, but written by great authors and beautifully illustrated. This one has a feel of the Polar Express to it.
Yeah.
But there are lots of them out there. The Tin Dims, certainly going to introduce children to lots of rich language, but it does have, Lydia Corrie's illustration is so captivating, and it has that imaginative element of creating your own environments, your own experiments, your own houses, your own Heath Robinson type illustration. I can see children playing around with that if they're given paper, pens, crayons to design their own. This one is from Marge in Charge, which I absolutely love, a sort of modern day Mary Poppins. And there's Fred the Wizard. I'm really just showing you the inside so you can see the full range and how the text is split up, and there's still plenty of illustration in there. The wonderful Wiggles Bottom Primary from Pamela Butchart's. Now I think there's 6 or 7 books in that series, and 2 small Toller. Also wanted to say that, of course, we're talking about mainly new books here, and the books that I've mentioned today are all in our book collections for year 2. So I'm just going to scroll that across the bottom in case you wanted to take a look. But we would always suggest not only having the new and the latest, but also old treasures are old treasures for a reason. I've put Little Red in there, you'll notice, Kiran, not because it's an old classic, but because it has longevity in it.
Absolutely.
It may not be 10 years old, but it's got that longevity, and it's not the most recently published, so that's in there with our teachers' treasures. So is there anything that you would like to say now we've got to the end of our exploration? You've given us so much to think about, Kiran.
I think we briefly touched on phonics, didn't we, and decoding, and I think it's just making that point that it's Key Stage 1 is a magical time for children, and it's that there is that emphasis on word recognition, definitely, but But I definitely believe, and it's something as practitioners of phonics that we do now, we bring in real text into our phonics session. So we do have that structure is there because synthetic phonics is proven, it's research driven, it's proven. But we never shy away from sharing a poem at the end of a session or a little bit of an extract from a certain book that we know they'll get eventually. So it might be by the end of the week. And fluency for us, and when I talk about fluency, about reading in phrasal units so that they understand why they're learning that skill. It's so that they can immerse themselves into a world that they won't have known before. And I think that's the magic when we're thinking about reading and phonics or decoding or word recognition or fluency, it's them understanding, it's to help them journey into new worlds and understand new things because that's what they are entitled to. I think it's never moving away from that message.
Thank you so much for joining me today, Kiran, and thank you for anybody who has been listening to today's webinar. And hopefully we'll see you again next time. So thanks for coming along. Bye, Kiran. Bye, everybody.
Thank you, Nikki.